No curse. Now, if you're looking for an opening line that illustrates brevity, I think that will do just fine. 2 words. No curse. Now, that's the way the Apostle John describes heaven in Revelation chapter 22, verse 3. Back in Revelation chapter 21, he used a whole bunch of words to describe heaven as this great, beautiful city up above. In chapter 22, he shortens his words. Now it's the Garden of Eden, and he pictures the river of life and the tree of life. But then in verse 3, he simply says, there will no longer be any curse. Heaven has no curse. Now that brings to mind the biblical idea of a divine curse, where God issues judgment upon the world because of sin. There are several occasions in the scriptures where you see God issue a divine curse. The most famous, and the one that's associated with the Garden of Eden, is in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam committed the first sin. Now when you read Genesis 3, you'll see the target of the curse. First is the serpent, the deceiver who led them astray. But secondly, it's Adam. After all, he was in charge and he sinned against God. But also Eve, because she was there with him and she too sinned and disobeyed. And then the earth itself, the place they lived, was put under God's curse. Now as God did that, he was responding to the sin that had been committed. Thus the curse was a penalty. It was a punishment. Their wrong actions deserved it. But it was more than that. It was a discipline. It was designed to encourage sinners to want to do right so they can get back into a life that has no curse. You see, if you lived in paradise and then you lose paradise, oh, you'll long to get back in it if what you go to is bad enough. And God made it bad enough. And thus the curse of Genesis 3 is a reminder that if you want to live in a paradise of righteousness, then you need to be righteous. You need to stop sinning. The curse of Genesis 3 came into effect a long time ago, and it's still in effect today. You see it daily. And it will remain in effect until the day you and I enter into heaven, and as John says, there's no curse. Now, what God did in Genesis 3 was take the natural order of creation, the way things work on planet Earth, and he disrupted the natural order. The key thing that's mentioned in Genesis 3 is weeds. Thorns and thistles will now rise up from the ground and interfere with your daily work. Now, that was very literal. We do have weeds, and they're very aggressive. But it was also a symbol of a whole host of other things that are now part of the creation, and they interfere with us enjoying life. They're frustrations we have to deal with. Take, for example, decay, rust, and corrosion. Paul mentions those things in Romans chapter 8, where he talks about how creation was subjected to futility. That's the curse. And it has the hope that one day it will be set free from its slavery to corruption and decay. If you look around, you'll see some of the things that are coming at us now that used to not be part of the creation, not in the beginning. The forces of nature have turned destructive. Storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tidal waves. You didn't have that in the Garden of Eden. We've got it now. But also animals. They have turned deadly in their aggression against us. But you saw something very peaceful back in the Garden of Eden. And then our own bodies have been afflicted by the curse of Genesis 3. God said to the woman, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. From now on, when you bring forth children, it will be painful. We speak of labor pains. There's also sickness and disease and disabilities, part of that corruption that Romans 8 mentioned. And of course, physical death. As Genesis 3 says, you came from the dust, one day you will go back to the dust. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, by one man came death. It's because of Adam that we all die. We're living in a sinful, cursed world. Now, we do have our moments where we see beauty and experience joy. But we also have those daily reminders of the curse. Too many occasions in our life where we have pain and suffering, where we have grief and sorrow. Now, what we do is we make the most of the world we've got. If this is where we're going to live, let's do something with it. But in our hearts, we long for a better place. And that's what John describes in Revelation 22, verse 3. There will no longer be any curse. Now, if John was going to describe all the blessings of heaven, that'd be a long list. And he could do that. Or you know what he could do? Just simply say two words, no curse. And in doing so, it eliminates all the bad things you can even imagine. All it leaves behind are the blessings and the joys of heaven. Now, in this same verse, John also uses another very simple statement. John says, the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it. That's it. But by mentioning the throne of God, he brings to mind God's authority. And that's very significant in this particular context, where he's using imagery from the Garden of Eden, referring us back to that first sin and to the curse that happened in Eden. Because, see, the problem in Eden was that man disobeyed God's rules and defied God's authority. So here's a good thing to keep in mind. There is no room in God's kingdom for those who will not obey the king. That's why God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden. There's no room in God's kingdom for those who will not obey the king. Now, the same is true in heaven as well. That's why heaven can be described as the new Eden, and it only allows those who will obey. Those who disobey and defy God on this earth will not be allowed in Eden, in heaven. They will be expelled from Eden. They'll be sent to hell. And you remember the cherubim with the flaming swords who kept Adam and Eve away from the garden? They're still in business, and they will keep the wicked, the defiant, the disobedient, keep them away from the heaven. Now, if you want to return to Eden, and I'm sure you do, you need to acknowledge the throne of God. Acknowledge his authority. Acknowledge the authority of Christ. You need to cease with your moments of little rebellions against his will. You need to fully obey the will of God and serve him if you want to be back in Eden. John also in verse 3 gives us one more short, sweet, and to-the-point statement. He says, his servants will serve him. Now, the Greek word for serve is the same word that would be used to describe a priest doing his priestly duties, his priestly service. Now, if your mind is thinking, oh, that would be the worship service, leading the song service and preaching and such as that, not exactly. I mean, that's part of it. But the emphasis upon doing the duties of the sanctuary. And if you watch the priest was busy all week long, not just on the worship day, but all throughout the week. He had a lot of jobs to do. They were part of being a priest. I'm going to suggest to you that when we get to heaven, we will have our priestly duties. That is, we're going to be busy doing whatever it is that God tells us to do. Which raises the question, is it possible there might be work that we do in heaven? Now, if you always thought, well, no, it's the land of rest. There's no work there. Think again. You know, in the original creation, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God created Adam, put him in a paradise, and gave him work to do. He gave him manual labor. Genesis 2:15 says that Adam was told to tend the garden, and that's before the curse of Genesis 3. He was a farmer before there was a curse. He was also given intellectual labor. He was told in Genesis 2 to put names on the animals. He has to use his mind and create names that will stick and be remembered. Now, whether he's working with his hands, rolling up his sleeves, or working with his mind, Adam was given jobs to do in God's paradise. He was a worker. You know, it's in our nature to work because, after all, we're in the image of God, and God is a worker. John chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus is criticized because he's working on a Sabbath. He says, are you kidding? My Father's always working. Every day he works. 24/7 he works, and so do I. You see, God is always active, always busy, always doing something productive. And when God created us in Genesis chapter 1, he told mankind to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. That's the word for be creative, make something out of it. He told us to be creative, to subdue, and then to rule over that which is before us. You see, heaven may be just like the original Garden of Eden, in that we'll have this paradise with blessed conditions. There's no curse, but we may find ourselves with things that God expects us to do, with duties that we've been assigned. Imagine a heaven where you have maintenance tasks, where in order to keep it going, somebody's got to show up each day and maintain. After all, Adam had to maintain the garden. He was a gardener. You may find some work of that sort in heaven. Maybe there'll be creative activities, like what Adam did when he was told to come up with some names for the animals. Perhaps there'll be some who will engage in literary and artistic creations. I'd love to hear some new music, see some new paintings, some new artist things. Maybe there'll be those of you who will roll up your sleeves and you'll be building and construction, or others who will be inventing and designing, and the list goes on and on. Picture a place where there's things to do, there's work to get done, and there's no curse, no weeds, no frustration. Now, you know, if you thought of heaven as no work, let me remind you of retirement. Retirement is great when you're not punching in the clock, no 40 hours a week, 9 to 5, no bosses, no deadlines, no production quotas, no stress. That's great, except when it's not great, when you've got nothing to do, when you've got nothing to accomplish, when there's nothing to enjoy and no satisfaction from a job well done. Then retirement's not so good. So I want you to imagine a heaven where we're going to be busy serving our Lord. Whatever He wants, we're going to do it, because after all, He sits on the throne. Now there'll be no curse, no toil and labor, no stress, no heartache. And if we can quote the seven dwarfs, hi ho, it's off to work we go, and we'll be whistling while we work, because that's the kind of joy we're going to have when we get to heaven. You do a good day's work, and then enjoy the words of our Heavenly Father. Well done, my good and faithful servant. And that's the picture I want you to imagine of heaven.